It's the Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Dan Principe. He's a boys advocate. He's an author, speaker, and he is an Australian of the Year nominee. He's also an ambassador for Consent Can't Wait, and he joins me on the podcast. We've been having a few conversations about consent lately. It's that time of the year with schoolies and kids leaving Year 12 and getting on with their lives, but also the federal government is really pushing this extremely hard right now. I'm an ambassador for Consent Can't Wait, so is Chanel Contos. We had her on the podcast last week, and like I said, Australian of the Year nominee, Dan Principe, joins me today. Australian of the Year nominee. Look at you go.
Yeah, it feels a bit, I don't even know how to respond to that. You've lost me for words. As someone who yaps every day, I'm done. I've got nothing to say other than it feels all the feelings and imposter syndrome double because I'm a Perth boy who's been acknowledged in New South Wales. So yeah, there's multiple layers of imposter syndrome happening here. Let's leave it at that.
Love the way I've started a podcast and my guest has already stopped talking. I don't know if that's a good start or a bad start.
Yeah, that's right.
Dan, let's talk about your area of specialty. Last week, my conversation with Chanel Contos was fairly general about consent. We did talk about adolescence a little bit, but your area of specialty is tween and teen boys. This is an area that you have become literally recognised as a national expert and treasure in. I have a double-barreled question, a terrible interview technique, but a double-barreled question to start. When it comes to our kids and consent, what's working and what's not? And let's turn it into two single questions. We'll start with the good and then we'll go to the bad. What is working when it comes to consent in this country right now with our tween and teen boys?
I think they're very open to the conversation. I don't think they need to be convinced that this is important. I don't get eye rolls. I don't get, oh, here we go again. I get, yeah, we get it. This is important for lots of different reasons, maybe for self-preservation or maybe because someone's like, I want to protect others. I want to make sure I'm safe or other people have pleasurable sexual experiences that I'm involved in. And so I see a great appetite. I don't think the conversation's exhausted. I think it's obviously the way we go about it and how we invite young people to have these conversations, and again, with them, not at them. And so I'm always enthused by boys wanting to have these conversations and doing that around some of the cultural messaging they get about what is it to be a man? How do we understand power, entitlement? How do we understand our roles in relationships? You know, should we be the strong provider? Can we have needs? Are we allowed to be loving? You know, all these sorts of things. So it's not just purely tied up in consent. We're trying to tackle it by thinking about a lot of the ideas we have about masculinity, relationships and sexuality. And I see the boys loving it. I think Australia does pretty well in having these conversations. Again, my bias is I'm obviously partnering with schools and communities that are very for and open to these conversations. So I haven't seen it as hard work in my experience. And even seeing parents realizing that these are conversations to be had and that we need to educate, that we can't bury our head in the sand. So I don't think we're there. I don't think we're as bad as some people like to say we are. Of course, we need to continue to improve and grow and get better at having these conversations and normalising it. But I actually think we're doing a decent job. Of course, we can do a better job. And yeah, my experience with boys is they're analysing this in brilliant ways. I think the opportunities to answer your second question is like maybe more to do with EQ, more to do with emotional literacy and being in tune with others and how we actually navigate consent, not so much as transactional and legalistically, but actually like, I really care about this other person. And not just in the realms of sex and romance, but just like I'm interested in your preferences, your desires, what you want, what you need. And that's just fundamental to who I am and how I want to show up as a person. So for me, I think where I think we need to improve the conversation is yes to consent, but there's more to the conversation and there's other skills to be learned and that make for a healthy relationship, romantic or otherwise.
The federal government's jumped in and said we need to spend millions of dollars on a campaign because consent can't wait. Clearly, they're identifying that there are some significant issues here. You paint a generally optimistic and quite rosy picture, for which I'm grateful. And I think that we need that, especially since there are so many people who are down on our boys. But if we just look at a handful of stats, Australian Institute of Health and Welfare research shows that when it comes to sexual assault, 97% of sexual assault in this country is male offenders and females are the ones who are the victims here. When it comes to the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, child-on-child sexual abuse is what's rising, and it's adolescent boys who are the ones who are most likely to offend. So there is clearly a consent conversation that needs to be happening. Why do you think that these awful statistics exist in spite of the, like I said, the optimistic picture that you paint?
I guess my optimistic picture is I think we are doing the consent conversation well, but I don't actually think that will tackle those stats because, as we know, 15 to 19-year-old boys are the highest perpetrators of sex offences in Australia. That's an awful stat. I hate quoting it, but I do at every PD and every parent community event because that's what we're navigating. Now, I don't think that's because we haven't had great consent conversations. I think that's because we haven't tackled some of the other elephants in the room, some of that being children and trauma. Some of that is young children's exposure to pornography. And we've seen recently on the ABC, child-on-child increased rates of sexual assault. And most of the academics are putting this down to pornography and pornography exposure and young kids acting that out. So I was really pleased that the Consent Can't Wait campaign was allowing me to talk about pornography, to gently address the elephant in the room and why we needed to talk about it and talk with our young people. So I think consent in schools is going well. I think where this campaign is pointing us and why we need to do better to address those stats is this was about parents talking to other parents and parents talking to their own young people about these conversations. So I'm making that distinction between who's having these conversations because, I'm in a world, and maybe it is a bubble, where schools and I are having great conversations about this, and I see the enthusiasm of young people. So the challenge is that we would normalize this and normalize talking about this well before our young person is even interested in romance and dating and sexual experiences and exploration.
Dan, if I'm a parent of a tween or a teen boy, what don't I know that I don't know? What I mean by this is, where are the gaps? Where are my blind spots as a parent of an adolescent boy?
Yeah, I think, and I get it. Like, your son is probably, and no doubt, a precious, lovely human who you get to see the best of. And perhaps you've also seen the challenging side too, because you're the parent. You're in there in the trenches day in, day out. I think the information gap that we do need to close, and I say this to parents often, is how many parents think their young person has been exposed to harmful content, and that could be violence, it could be racist, but most of the time it's pornographic. And how many parents realize that is also their young person. So there's a bit of a gap between my child versus the realities of how many young people have been exposed. And the average age of exposure, as we know, is seen conservatively as like 13, but we know it's dropping, and there's more research suggesting it's more likely 11 for boys. And so I think acknowledging that, and what I really want to jump in and say is that your young person is not bad, wrong, evil, in trouble, awful, because they have been exposed to any kinds of harmful content online. As some people may know, I've told my story in mainstream media. I was 11 years old when I was exposed to pornography. I wasn't a bad kid. I was shown it by someone else, which is the most common way young kids are exposed, or it's pop-ups on their online spaces, or thirdly, they're searching out of curiosity. None of those reasons, and whatever the reason, is cause to punish them, to shame them. This is just the world they're in, and we just have to equip them for it to know that they can come to mum, dad, trusted caregiver if this does happen. But the point I want to make is I was 11. I've been exposed to pornography, which scientists and psychologists call a supernormal stimulus. That's just spiked my curiosity, my dopamine, feelings of both shame and awkwardness and am I in trouble, with also curiosity and, that felt nice because I had a nice dopamine rush. But the point I want to make is it started to say something to me, teach me something. And that's the question I always want to ask is, what is it shaping us to believe about men, women, sex, power, consent, pleasure, bodies? Are we learning healthy things or harmful things, especially for young people and the other social conditioning they may actually receive about, what it is to be a man? And the stat is that for boys are usually exposed 3 years before their first kiss. And for girls, it's 2 years before their first kiss, which is a lot of time to have your ideas about something that most parents will view as significant, some parents will view as sacred, to be shaped by this external force, this $100 billion a year industry that makes up 30 to 50% of the internet. So we have to just talk about it. And that's what I want parents to know. This isn't something that we can avoid. We just have to talk about it in the most gentle, media literacy friendly way, where we're critically and analysing the messages young people and boys are getting.
Dan, you are aware I've spoken with you about this, and you will probably be featuring in the new book that I'm writing about raising boys. I interviewed a journalist just a couple of weeks ago. Her name was Kate Brown, and she described how her daughter was approached online for explicit content. She was only 13 or 14 years of age or something like that. And when her daughter came out to her in the living room and said, "Mum, this has just happened," and Kate got involved, she discovered by following the links that the person who was making the request, this non-consensual request for explicit content from a 13-year-old girl, was a little red-headed, freckled 13-year-old boy who literally looked like he could be the boy next door. And at that point, she said she had this eye-opening awareness, this awakening that the bad guys, quote unquote, the bad guys on the internet aren't these 50, 60, 70-year-old seedy pedophiles in their basements. They are just the boy next door. And she also then softened it, as you did, and suggested maybe they're not bad guys so much as they're young men who are going through a range of very big learning moments, and they need to have these conversations so that little girls like hers aren't getting these kinds of requests. I'm sure that you've heard stories like that countless times, and probably far worse. In the work that you do, I would expect that that would be the case. If I'm a parent and I'm hearing a story like that, and I have a daughter that I'm just wanting to protect, or I have a son who I want to make sure doesn't become a perpetrator of an act like this, what are my starting points in a consent can't wait context? What are starting points for protecting my kids from being either victims or perpetrators?
Such an important question. And I think we have to start by saying that you're not alone in this. I don't want a parent sitting there thinking, "Oh my gosh, I must have just been such a monstrous, or I've failed." It's not about that. The culture makes this nearly impossible to avoid altogether because young people are being exposed to this content. So I just want the parent not to feel a sense of negative emotion or guilt around this, because sadly, this is the world that we're navigating. Of course, we have to do our utmost to keep our young people safe. And it's just not a reflection on you, and it's not a reflection on your child. Like, they have been exposed to something that has shaped them and normalized things that just aren't normal and aren't healthy and aren't safe. From there, I think, we do have to talk to our young person about how they got this idea or where they learnt this from. I think it's so important that we're having preventative conversations as well as the, proactive in response to things, to say to our young person, like, if anything makes you feel uncomfortable online, if you see anything or someone tells you that we've got to keep a secret or they're pressuring you, because the biggest worry is that young people are so at risk to being kind of coerced into thinking that they're going to be punished, that their parents aren't going to love them or support them anymore. They're kind of manipulated into thinking that they're alone if this happens, or if they do something quote unquote naughty online. And I think it's just so important that we just, as much as possible, overdose them, if I'm allowed to say that, on the positive message that you're never going to be in trouble. Because young people tell me often that they think they're going to burden their parents or they're going to overreact, and so they don't want to disturb them or create drama for the family. And so as much as possible, we have to make sure that they know that they can come to us and have those conversations about what is safe, what is respectful, what maybe makes them feel uncomfortable.
Dan, there's a 3-word statement that I make a big deal about on the podcast and in my presentations, and it's the 3 words that parents need their kids to hear from them more than any other. And it's not "I love you"; it's the 3 that come next, no matter what. The way that I phrase that is, anything that happens, I promise you that my love for you is bigger than that thing. You do the wrong thing online, my love for you is bigger than that. You end up in some trouble because of X, Y, or Z, my love for you is bigger than that thing. You can always come to me. And I love the articulate way in which you've described that. Our time's almost up. I have 2 more questions for you, because I can never just do one more. I want to go right back to the start of the pod, as we were talking about how we can support our children through this. You began to speak about parents of young men and the kinds of attributes and characteristics that it's just incumbent on us to instill in them so that they can become strong men of the future. You spoke so well about it, and I flagged it as you were saying it. We've got to come back to it. Can you describe for me what your picture is of a young man who is getting it right in a world that as you highlighted, is giving them so many messages that are not in their best interests.
I tell boys every day, your parents, your school and I aren't expecting you to be perfect, but we want to champion you to be the type of young men where people feel safe and loved and respected by you, where people feel that they can be themselves and that you use your gifts, your talents, your energy to contribute to others' lives and relationships in such a life-giving way. And I feel like that is one of our absolute utmost urgent duties right now, is to really tell boys like that we champion them, that we see such a place for them and what they have to offer the world, and to give them that vision. And yeah, I get to see it. Like I say this like every day in every postcode, doesn't matter where I am. I know I'm going to see incredible insights and empathy from young boys. It's helping them have the courage to live that out, because I think some of the social norms that punish those better traits make it hard for boys to live out of that place. So for example, 99 times out of 100 workshops, boys will never bring up the word love or loving in terms of what is it to be a good man. Why is that? Not because they don't believe it. It's because they tell me, and usually the younger pups certainly will, that it's seen as feminine or weak. So we clearly as a society have to do more to say to boys, no, you're fully human too. You get to love and be loving and be loved. Like that is a part of who you are and your contribution to the world. And so that for me is like part of the broader task of making sure we encourage and nurture the soft skills and EQ so they can get consent right. Because you can learn it intellectually, but it's actually to have the heart muscles and the courage to be like, yeah, I want to be a man who's loving and respectful and safe, and for people to experience me like that.
Dan, here's what's perfect about that response. Much of what we discuss when it comes to consent is we talk about the legalistic view. We talk about the actionable, practical elements of this is what consent is. It's where you want something, they want something, you both want the same thing, therefore it's okay to do it. You're going to be excited about the fact that it happened tomorrow as you reflect on it. That's consent, right? That's the stuff that we hear all the time. What you're doing is you're couching a consent conversation in a broader conversation or discussion about character and the development of a whole person. I just think you're an incredible advocate for boys. You're so articulate, and I'm really grateful to know you. I'm getting a little bit weepy just thinking about the impact that you have as you travel around this country and you do talk after talk after talk. And I know sometimes you stand in the halls, as I do, at schools, and there's a bunch of kids who are sitting in that back corner rolling their eyes going, oh, who's this guy at the front that reckons he knows something? Don't care, don't want to know. I think you stand tall. I think you articulate so well. And anyone who has listened to this podcast, I believe, will be blown away by what you've had to say. Dan Principe, what a privilege to have you on the Happy Families podcast. I think you're doing great work. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you for the privilege and the kind words and more of this and more of hearing dads talking about what you just shared as well. So thank you.
Oh, you know what? I'm supposed to ask another question as well. Whereabouts are the resources for people who want to know more about teaching their kids consent? That's the whole purpose of this conversation. We should talk about that in 20 seconds.
Head to consent.gov.au, and obviously what we're going to get there is conversation starters between parents, but also how to have them with our young people. Again, normalising it with other parents, what's working for them, what's helped them break through in these conversations, and then age appropriate ways to have these conversations with all age children. And so please check them out. I vouch for them. There's no milkshake ads to be found here. This is quality scientific research from experts who have actually done the work of talking to people of all ages about these topics.
Dan Principe, boys advocate, author, speaker, and Australian of the Year nominee and ambassador for Consent Can't Wait. Details at consent.gov.au. We will link to that in the show notes. And if you're a school teacher or a head of wellbeing or a deputy principal or somebody who makes decisions about what happens in schools, look him up, Dan Principe. What's your website, Dan?
It's just danielprincipe.com.au.
Great to have you along, Dan. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. If you would like more information, we will link to everything about Dan and also about the consent conversation by the federal government's website, consent.gov.au, in the show notes. Hey, look, so many important conversations here. I hope it sparks something for you, and I hope that it creates something that leads to a healthy conversation in your home with your kids. Check out the website for more. Tomorrow on the pod, we're getting into This Week in Parenting. Teens are getting Nick sick with Zins and a whole lot more. For more information about making your family happier, you'll find it at happyfamilies.com.au.